EVO.
Welcome back to The Devil Within. This is part 2 of The Red Coat, the chapter where the story stops pretending to be reasonable. Last time we traced the final known movements of a girl who shouldn't have vanished. This time, we follow the ripples her disappearance left behind. The search parties that found impossible footprints, the investigators who couldn't let go, and the strange atmospheric weight that settles over anyone who walks the same ground today. So take a breath. This is where the shadows finally answer back. This is Chapter 4, Patterns in the Dark. If Paula's disappearance had been the only one, the mountain might have settled into that familiar American category of wilderness tragedy. A heartbreak, softened by the rational comforts of geography, weather, and chance. People die in forests. People get lost. The natural world has a long and indiscriminate appetite. But Paula was not the first name that Glastenbury kept, and she wouldn't be the last. And when people looked back across the decade that framed her fate, they began to see something deeply unnerving. Her story didn't stand alone. It fit, it aligned. It belonged to a pattern older than she was. The first to vanish was Middie Rivers, a man whose knowledge of the terrain bordered on myth. He could track a deer across ledges no boot print should have survived and navigate by the grain of wood. In November 1945, a year before Paula set foot on the long trail, he led a group of hunters through Bickford Hollow. At some point, he stepped ahead to scout the path, turned a corner, and ceased to exist. His companions found no sign of struggle, no dropped gear, nothing to suggest he'd ever stood on the dirt they were staring at. One moment he was walking, the next he was legend. A year later came Paula, whose disappearance ignited the state's largest search since the war, and whose absence felt stranger precisely because she was not a seasoned woodsman. She was an 18-year-old college student out for a hike. How she could vanish as thoroughly as Middie, leaving the same blank trail, the same infuriating silence, made no sense. And then in 1949 came James Tedford, a veteran returning to the Bennington Soldiers' Home. He boarded a bus in St. Albans. He was seen by passengers at the previous stop. When the bus reached Bennington, he was gone. As stated, his luggage remained overhead. His timetable was probably still in his pocket. If Paula's disappearance felt supernatural because it lacked evidence, Tedford's felt supernatural because it lacked opportunity. The bus doors never opened. The bus never stopped. Yet the man seemingly just evaporated. The following year brought Paul Jepson, that 8-year-old boy, also wearing a bright red jacket, another too vivid color swallowed by the mountain. He'd been helping his mother tend the family's pigs near the base of Glastenbury. She turned her head. When she turned back, he was gone. Bloodhounds were able to track him to the same stretch of trail where Paula disappeared, but then they lost the scent entirely, as though the earth itself had just breathed it in. And then came Frieda Langer, the hiker who fell into a stream. She told her cousin she'd run home to change clothes and vanished along that same set of ridges. Months later, her body would be found in a place that had already been searched by dozens of men repeatedly in daylight. But her remains told no story at all. The mountain offered no reason for the impossibility. 5 disappearances, 5 years, 1 mountain. People talked about coincidence, of course. They preferred it. But coincidence is a fragile structure, and Glastenbury seemed to lean against it until it wobbled. Hunters whispered about regions of strange quiet, places where even experienced outdoorsmen felt watched. Rangers reported hearing distant voices, never words, just tones echoing in places where sound should have been swallowed by snow. A farmer swore he'd seen a column of light rise between the trees, straight as a candle flame, then flicker out the moment he shouted. He'd never shouted that loud before. The Abenaki stories resurfaced in town meetings and barroom conversations. Tales of land that shifted underfoot, of spirits who guarded certain ridges, of a mountain that demanded respect. None of these tales described malevolence, just territory. Territory defended not by claws or storms, but by removal, by silence, by absence. Now, newspapers loved the geometry. They drew crude maps connecting the vanishings, forming a rough triangle whose vertex pointed directly into the heart of the mountain. And once the public had a shape, they had a name: the Bennington Triangle. But names don't make legends. Patterns make legends. When residents looked back, the pattern felt too clean, too intentional. It invited superstition. It invited dread. It invited stories that rational people don't tell unless darkness has settled and their confidence has softened enough to let the old fears breathe. Some believe Glastenbury was a place where the veil between worlds grew very thin. Others blamed magnetic anomalies that could disorient even the sharpest minds. A few insisted that something, animal, human, or otherwise, lived deeper in the woods than anyone was willing to admit. Whatever people believed, they all agreed on one thing: none of the disappearances behaved like accidents, and the mountain, unmoved, offered no corrections. In the months after Paula vanished, the long trail grew lonelier. Hikers avoided it. Locals warned tourists away. The forest seemed to know it had a new story, and stories, like storms, gather strength when they're unchallenged. By the following winter, even sunlight felt different on Glastenbury. Colder, as if it traveled a greater distance to reach the ground. Trails seemed to drift subtly, the way memory shifts when you're certain you've taken the same path before, but somehow land somewhere unfamiliar. Even seasoned hikers admitted the mountain's temperament had changed, as though Paula's disappearance had awakened something dormant. If the mountain had been content to take a woodsman, a soldier, a child, maybe it was testing its boundaries. But when it took a young woman bright enough to be seen from a ridgeline, it became impossible to ignore the pattern any longer. That was when people began to wonder, not whether the mountain was dangerous, but whether it was choosing. Chapter 5. The Hunger Beneath the Pines. By the time Frieda Langer's body was found, months after she disappeared, months after men had already marched over the same patch of ground, something in the collective imagination of Bennington snapped. The rational world, which had been gallantly holding the line through 5 years of vanishings, finally stepped back and admitted that whatever lived on Glastenbury Mountain was playing by rules that no one understood. Searchers had combed that place repeatedly. They'd walked arm to arm across the clearing, pushed through the brush, shaken branches, probed beneath rocks and fallen logs. They'd noted the area in their journals. They'd mapped it, swept it again after the thaw. And yet her body appeared, suddenly, intact, identifiable, almost gently placed right in the open, as though the mountain had decided the story needed an ending, and this was the moment to provide one. It wasn't a victory. It was a reminder. It was a warning. A punctuation mark dropped at the end of a sentence the living didn't realize that they'd been reading. And that was when the whispers hardened into something else. Not belief. Belief is too loud a word. But recognition. Something was wrong in those woods. People began to describe Glastenbury as if it had moods. A hunter said the air would thicken without warning, like stepping into a warm room after being outside in the cold. A postal worker delivering mail near the base of the mountain said that he'd heard what sounded like children giggling deep in the brush, only to realize the laughter wasn't playful. It was imitating play, as though something wanted him to follow. There were stories about lights, thin, pale veils floating between the trunks, never bright enough to be headlamps, never low enough to be fireflies. Some said the lights pulsed like they were breathing. Others said they flickered the way a flame behaves when someone is standing too close. One woman swore she saw a figure in a red coat walking up a ridge at dusk, the silhouette steady and unhurried and never looking back. When she called out, the figure didn't react. When she tried to follow, her boots sank into snow that reached nearly to her knees, while the figure's footprints, if they were prints at all, glided across the surface, barely disturbing it. She left the mountain that day shaking, unsure if she had witnessed a ghost or something even stranger. An invitation. And yet, despite the fear, people kept returning to the mountain. Some out of habit, some out of stubbornness, and some out of a quiet, private impulse to confront the very place that had carved a hole in their community. They described the mountain as though it were an animal, coiled, listening, attentive. A few said they smelled metal in the air, like an iron gate had just swung open. Others heard footsteps behind them that matched their pace until the trail split, at which point the steps continued down the opposite path. More than one man saw shadows move against the direction of the sun. Now, none of those accounts made the papers. They were traded quietly, the way people pass gossip about an illness too terrible to name. And then there was the strange phenomenon searchers called the hush. It came without warning. A sudden, total absence of sound. No birds, no wind, no rustling branches, not even the tick of snow settling on hemlock boughs. Just a dense, humming quiet, like being sealed inside a shell. The hush could last seconds or minutes. One ranger said it felt like standing inside a held breath. Another said it felt like God looking away. The hush terrified people more than the disappearances themselves, because the vanishings could still be explained, barely, by missteps, by accidents or human error. But the hush suggested intent. It suggested awareness, a presence that could quiet the world whenever it wished. And then came the sightings, small, scattered, unsettling. A hiker on Harmon Hill swore he saw a woman standing between the trees at dawn, her back turned, her red coat bright against the frost. He waved. She lifted her head as though listening, but by the time he reached the spot, she was gone. But her scent, a faint note of wool and winter air, lingered for hours. A photographer near the long trail captured a frame that looked completely normal until he developed it. Only then did he see a pale face in the corner of the shot, blurred, half-lit, and positioned at a height far too tall for any human standing on level ground. He burned the negative. And a pair of teenagers claimed they'd heard someone whispering their names in the fog. They ran, they didn't look back, and they didn't go hiking again for years. The locals didn't call it haunted. Haunted implies there's something left to haunt. This was different. This felt like the land itself was sentient, watching and choosing, remembering. The Abenaki had long said the mountain was alive. They never meant it poetically, they meant it literally. The settlers dismissed those stories, as settlers always do, until the disappearances began to stack like stones in a chimney, pointing toward an uncomfortable truth. Glastenbury wasn't merely dangerous. It was deliberate. Some believed the mountain itself had a kind of hunger, not for flesh, but just for presence, for story, for the energy people carried with them when they entered the trees. Something in the mountain collected those energies the way the ocean collects wreckage. And maybe that's why so many of the missing were last seen walking away. Not struggling, not screaming, not fleeing, just moving deeper into the woods with a kind of strange, serene purpose. As though something inside the forest was calling them by name. And always, the red coat lingered in the imagination, a bright slash of color in a landscape that preferred shadows. Some said Paula's ghost still walked the trail. Some said the mountain took her body. Some said she crossed into something older than human time. And a few, the ones who rarely spoke, they said the truth was simpler. The forest eats people. It always has. It always will. And Glastenbury, patient and ancient, is merely better at it than most. Chapter 6. The Last Light on the Trail. In the years after the disappearances, the long trail became a kind of pilgrimage site. Not the religious kind, but the stranger human kind, where people travel somewhere dangerous not because they expect a miracle, but because they hope to touch the edge of an unanswered question. The hikers who came to Glastenbury didn't always admit why they were there. They said they wanted scenery or solitude, fresh air, but they lingered just a little too long at the trail markers. They studied the ravines with an intensity born from the desire to see something impossible. They looked up at the ridges where the search parties once shouted Paula's name and listened for echoes that never came back. And always, in the back of their minds, they wondered. What did she see in those last moments? What did she hear? What made her keep walking? Some believed Paula simply got lost. Others made peace with darker explanations. But those who spent enough time on the mountain, people who walked the trails in winter, who camped beneath the trembling branches, who learned the rhythm of the forest's breathing, came away convinced that the mountain was not a place where someone lost their way. It was a place where the way itself changed. Those who've studied the disappearances say the same thing. Paula should have been found, even if she'd fallen, even if she'd frozen, even if she'd taken a wrong turn. The forest should have given up something. Fabric, bone, boot print, a disturbed patch of earth. Instead, it gave nothing. The silence around her became part of that forest's architecture, like another tree ring added to an ancient trunk, widening with each passing year. Decades later, a journalist interviewing old searchers noted something odd. Every man described the same moment. A moment alone in the trees when the air pressed in, when the forest grew so still they could hear their pulse in their teeth, when they felt, without evidence, without logic, that the mountain had turned to look at them. That if they called out Paula's name again, the wrong thing might answer. One man, who never allowed his name to be printed, put it simply. The woods knew we were looking, and they chose not to help. As the years passed, the mythology grew more detailed. There were stories of hikers who glimpsed a figure moving between the pines, a girl in a red coat, or at least a smear of red, bright against the frost. Some saw her waving before she vanished. Others said she stood perfectly still, as though waiting for someone to walk toward her. A few insisted her footprints led nowhere. Another story came from a pair of hunters who camped near Hell Hollow. They woke at dawn to the sound of footsteps circling their tent. Not animal steps, human steps. Slow, deliberate, dragging slightly, like someone walking through snow that wasn't actually there. When they finally unzipped the flap, the clearing was empty. Their fire was cold, and in the center of the ring of ash was a long, single trail of bare footprints, small, delicate, leading into the trees until they stopped at a place where no one could track them any further. Now, locals warned those hunters not to follow, not because of ghosts. Vermonters don't like to commit to ghosts, but because the mountain likes to borrow people. Borrow. Not steal, not kill. Borrow. As though the forest simply holds on to certain souls for reasons we're not meant to understand. Some hikers dismissed all of this, of course. They came through Glastenbury without incident, never sensing the hush or the weight or the impossible geometry. They crossed its slopes like any other patch of woods. They lived their lives untouched. And yet, even they stopped speaking when night fell. Even they walked a little faster when the shadows began to thicken. Even they noted how early darkness arrived here, how quickly the light drained, how the mountain seemed to inhale the last warmth of day and leave behind only its own cold breath. Now, there is a photograph, circulated online, sometimes debunked, sometimes defended, of a figure standing in a gap between the trunks. The head's tilted, the coat is red, the background is the gray-blue of winter trees. There's no date stamp, no metadata, no consensus on whether it's real. But the people who know the legend don't dismiss it overnight. They look at the face, or what might be a face, and feel something tighten beneath their ribs. Because it's not what you see in the photo, it's what you don't. There is no trail, there's no shadow, there's no path leading towards or away. Just the stillness of someone who is not entirely here, but also not entirely gone. Every so often, hikers still vanish near Glastenbury. Not often enough to make national headlines, but often enough for locals to say quietly that the mountain remembers its own patterns. It remembers the red coat. It remembers the other four. It remembers the taste of silence when the last flashlight beam fades. And maybe, just maybe, it remembers the way Paula walked, with her hands tucked into her pockets, her breath turning silver in the cold, her heart beating a little faster because she was young and restless and alive, because she believed the trail was something that would always lead home, because she had no reason in the world to fear a patch of forest on an autumn afternoon. She walked into the mountain. She disappeared, and the trail has kept her footsteps ever since. If you hike the long trail near dusk, there's a moment when the light changes. It's not gradual, it's sudden, as though someone dimmed the world a single notch. Then the air goes still, and the pines lean. And if you're not paying attention, if you take 2 steps too many past the safe hours of the day, you might feel something behind you, an ancient, patient attention settling onto your shoulders. Most people turn back. A few keep walking. And somewhere deep in the heart of Glastenbury, the forest waits. It has all the time in the world. And that concludes The Redcoat, a story that refuses to behave, refuses to resolve, and refuses to sit quietly inside the boundaries of the explainable. Maybe the truth was lost to the woods, maybe it was swallowed by fear, and maybe, in ways we don't like to admit, the truth was always standing right in front of us, wearing a color no witness could ignore. If this episode stayed with you, share it, talk about it, keep the story alive, because sometimes the only justice a disappearance gets is remembrance. And thank you for listening to The Devil Within, and as always, stay curious, stay skeptical, and stay a little afraid of the things that don't add up. And without our terrific sponsors who still believe in long-form storytelling, we wouldn't be able to continue the show. Make sure you check the show notes for this show and every show for some promo codes that will give you great deals from those great companies. And check out the entire Evio Creative slate. The Devil Within, Criminal Mischief, Taboo Treasures, The Devil's Ledger, and The Ides of April. Visit evocreative.com and follow us on Instagram at The Devil Within Pod, at evocreative, at Ides of April Pod, and at taboo_treasures. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there.